we need to peel all of that back. And all of those onion layers are shadow. They're masks we wear. In this work of neural manifestation, which is so different than the old New Age kind of spiritual bypass approach, the more you say no, the more magnetic you become. From To Be Magnetic, this is the Expanded Podcast with your host, Lacy Phillips. As the leading destination for neural manifestation, we dispel the woo-woo in order to help you create real, tangible results based on neuroplasticity, psychology, epigenetics, and energetics. Our goal is to normalize the practice of manifestation and empower you to get into the driver's seat of your life in order to manifest the experiences, relationships, and things that most align with your authenticity. Part of our manifestation process entails expanding past your limiting subconscious beliefs. Therefore, by tuning into this podcast with interviews from experts, thought leaders, spiritual teachers, scientists, and those with neural manifestation success stories, you're starting the process of expanding your subconscious in order to see to believe that anything you desire is possible. And by pressing play, the process begins.
Hello, Magnetic Community. It's Amanda Blair, one of TBM's coaches, and I wanted to share with you the story of how I used the shadow workshop to help manifest one of my biggest manifestations to date, and that is my one-bedroom apartment in New York City. I had been actively trying to manifest my apartment for 2 years before I actually did it. I had found 2 years ago an apartment but lost it. And that year leading up to the manifestation was the most powerful for shifting and reprogramming. I really started to dig into feeling worthy of having my own apartment. I really started to increase the gradual work I had been doing to get from lack mentality into abundance. That really started to shift during that year. And I found really great expanders. I had a friend who expanded me on getting approved for an apartment in New York. I was without a cosigner and I didn't think I could actually get approved on my own. But this friend, thank goodness, shared with me that you don't have to jump through all the hoops you think you do, and alternative ideas into getting approved, which I'm so grateful for. And then once I had that expander, actually another one came in that shared her story of getting approved with these alternative ideas. So that was really helpful. And then Salwa got her apartment before I did, and that really expanded me. I felt like, okay, if she can do this, I can do it. It's coming for me too. And that gave me a lot of momentum. But there was this one last little doubt that I couldn't get down to, and I couldn't figure out what it was. And I had been working on it for 2 months pretty actively with various DIs. And then during one deep meditation, it downloaded, ooh, I feel like a loser, and a loser can't live in her own apartment. So I had no idea where that came from. I, have no memories of being shamed for being a loser or, anything like that. So I was really confused. So I took it to the work as always, and I went into the shadow workshop. And through the shadow workshop, I was able to peel back enough layers to realize that that came from my mom's friends shaming my dad for being a loser. And therefore, when I was young, I took any aspect that was like my dad and threw it in my shadow. I was like, I'll be rejected if I'm this. I'll be called a loser if I'm like this. I won't be loved. And then through the shadow workshop, learned how to out and own that aspect of myself. So I started looking at all the positive things that my dad gave me. I started to see the traits in which I'm like him as beautiful, as, traits that make me lovable, as traits that, make me me, that make me shine, what have you, and just really started to out and own to further integrate through that process. And then the secret sauce was right after I did shadow, and I started this round of shadow in March 2020, right around the lockdown. I moved into the reinforcing deservingness and abundance DI. And if you've ever had a session with me, you know how much I love that DI. It's just the best. And so I jumped right into that, and I did that for 2 months. So as soon as I finished shadow in March, I jumped into that DI. I did it twice a day, once in the morning, once at night. And then I did it all through April and then into May. And in May, pretty much to the day of 2 months, I manifested my apartment. And the reason why I feel that reinforcing DI after doing shadow was so important was shadow really helped me get to the root of the aspect, helped me see where it comes from and integrate it. And then in the reinforcing DI, I was able to start living authentically with that integrated aspect. So I was really starting to move from that place of authenticity with having that new aspect integrated, which felt incredibly powerful. And I'm convinced led to my apartment finally coming in because it had been circling for a while. I also was able to get everything on my list and more. I was looking for a studio apartment in New York City, and I ended up finding a 1-bedroom for the exact price I wanted to pay for my studio, and literally everything on the list. Big windows, big kitchen, bathtub, everything there. The only kind of funny thing is I didn't specify how big I wanted my bathtub to be, and it is quite small. So it's pretty hard to bathe in, which I'm always like, remember, you got to tell the universe, exactly what you want as a specific manifestor. But everything else is like more than I could have ever thought. So that shadow workshop really allowed me to peel back the layers, get to the root, integrate, and then the reinforcing DI allowed me to reinforce all that beautiful integration. So that was my beautiful process that brought me this big manifestation, which I'm so thrilled about. And I hope that story helps. I hope it inspires you to jump into shadow and look at those aspects, because when you can start to integrate them, magic happens. If you want to know more, or if you have questions or comments, you can look in the show notes to figure out where to connect with me on Instagram. And of course, if you want to dive deeper, I would love to connect over a session. That'll be in the show notes as well, how to book, and enjoy the episode.
Welcome back to another Explained episode, which has quickly become your favorite segment of the entire podcast, Expanded. In Explained, Dr. Tara Swart joins my co-host Jessica Gill and I in deep diving on specific themes within manifestation, which all of you love because it's where we bridge our process of manifestation with neuroscience and psychology and the deep science that anchors it all together. Back in July, Dr. Tara Swart joined us as our psychology and neuroscience advisor. And why we handpicked her, besides the fact that she's so unbelievably marvelous, she has a PhD in neuroscience and a former medical career as a psychiatrist of 7 years. She's also a senior lecturer and on faculty at MIT, no big deal, and senior lecturer at King's College. She's currently working on research projects on plasticity and epigenetics. She has Google Talks, LinkedIn, Facebook, and 2 TED Talks. She's also the author of 3 books, her latest being The Source. So let's get into another Explained episode where Dr. Tara and I break down the energetics and science of manifestation, offering a roundtable perspective on the deep intricacies and connection. Here goes.
Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of Expanded. We have an Explained episode today on shadow, a topic we cover often, but it's really nice to do a deep dive with both Lacy and Dr. Tara here. So I'll kick us off with a quote. Take note of how you speak to yourself. There's a difference between taking responsibility for your life and perpetually punishing yourself. So I actually wanted to start here with this quote today because I feel like so many times people think shadow work is so fearful and it means you have to punish yourself for rejecting aspects of yourself or incorporating things that you don't like about yourself, and it's so scary. But actually, obviously taking accountability for yourself is important, but the shadow work isn't about continuing that cycle of shame. It's about integrating those parts so we release this shame. So I felt like this quote was really kind of on the nose of what shadow work is. You know, take responsibility for your life, but don't perpetually punish yourself for it. And when you can integrate your shadow, you can stop punishing yourself.
Agreed. Yeah. And I think another really important aspect of that is that you can fully start to be seen and fully start to access your authentic self, which means that you're not using as much energy as you have in the past to loop and be in insecurities and fear and worry and not good enough. So it's actually, like, more than anything, a path to freedom, in my opinion, rather than that perpetuation of shame, which is essentially what continuing to have shadow aspects that we know may exist, but we don't take the time to integrate them is. It's just like perpetuating that. Whereas when we do take the time to integrate and release and own, that's where the real freedom and happiness and authenticity comes. And of course, magnetism.
And so shadow is defined as, and we define at TBM, as qualities within humanity or yourself that you've deemed as unlovable due to pain, shame that you've experienced or witnessed. You've disowned these aspects of yourself and placed them in your shadow. This creates low self-worth on a subconscious level. So how does shadow work and understanding shadow play into manifestation? And how would you sort of define shadow from a neuroscience or psychology perspective also, Dr. Tara?
Yeah, let's kick it off to you first, Dr. Tara, so people have a really deep understanding of what shadow clinically is.
Well, I just wanted to pick up on something that you said, Lacy, because I actually really loved the way that you said it, which was that you use up so much energy dealing with this shame and guilt. From a neuroscience point of view, we do use up quite a lot of energy on our own internal negative, or what I prefer to call survival emotions, like shame and guilt. But part of shadow is that because you're so ashamed of these aspects of yourself, you have to wear a mask to present yourself socially that doesn't give a glimpse of those things you're ashamed of to other people. And that's really hard work. So basically, you're using up cognitive resources to manage your own shame and to present a face to the world that doesn't have those horrible things in their character that you're so ashamed of. And manifestation it's hard work neurally. You know, it's changing your brain pathways or strengthening weaker ones. And you need to be well rested and well resourced in terms of your diet and your mindset to be able to really go through that work without, sort of draining yourself and to do it to the best of your ability. So to the first part of Jessica's question, I would say that, yes, we approach shadow work with a lot of fear. Even I did, even though I'm a psychiatrist and I understand the theory of it. I felt that if I did unblocked shadow, I would find out all sorts of things about myself that I didn't want to find out. It's almost like the better you are at throwing things into your shadow, the more you have to fear about what you then may face. So there's that fear, which in any type of learning, and neural manifestation is a way of learning because it's changing your brain pathways, can inhibit that learning happening optimally. And also just how much hard work it is to connect up new neurons to overwrite brain pathways. So yeah, that's my answer to the first part of the question. And then was the second part of the question, what is shadow kind of psychologically?
Yeah, like how do you see it?
And yeah, explaining it, sort of what it is. I think a lot of people listening maybe might be hearing about the term for the first time. We're constantly having to re-educate because it's like second nature to TBM. But if you're listening for the first time clinically, what is shadow?
So shadow is the part of your personality that you don't want to see. And when you're a baby or a child, you depend upon your caregivers to keep you safe and to build the neural architecture of trust and love. And so you work out what is good behavior and what you don't get rewarded for. So for example, if you're a child and you do something wonderful and you tell everyone about it and your parents say, oh, stop showing off, Tara, then what you sort of start to understand is that if I tell people the good things that I've done, my parents get angry with me. So I should put that into my shadow. If I do something good, I can be pleased with myself, but I must not tell anyone. And equally, last time we talked about jealousy and envy and sibling rivalry. So again, if you don't share with your siblings, if you are jealous because they're getting more attention from your parents, then you get told, oh, you're always so jealous of your siblings. So anything that you were told as a negative that you fear will mean that you don't have loving relationships in your life, you'll put away into your shadow. So it is a part of your innate personality, but it's one that you hide away. And I think it's confusing because there's a lot of psychoanalytic research, mostly from Freud and Jung, that uses different terms like ego and id and persona and animus and things like that. So Freud had 16 such terms. Jung had boiled it down to 4, and it was more progressive. So I personally prefer Jung's work. But basically, shadow is these difficult feelings that we don't like to face. And the ego is our sense of self. So we really rely on the ego to say, well, I would like to go and look at those things and see what they are and see what I can do about them. But if your sense of self isn't developed enough to do that, then it won't be happy to let those things come to the surface. So there's quite an internal battle in just even starting that work, or, certainly going through it.
Yeah, so I think, I was kind of trying to distill it down to when I was thinking about this episode. And so kind of what I'm hearing from you, Dr. Tara, is also that you hear others perhaps shame you or shame people around you, because it can also be if you, let's say, see a friend get picked on for having a certain trait, then you're like, oh no, they got picked on. I don't want to have that either. You sort of reject that in yourself and suppress any aspects of that self that are similar in you and try to reject it and fight it off and pretend that's not you or you're not going to show that to anyone. And then the other piece too is that when that aspect surfaces, let's say your parents said you were jealous of a sibling, when jealousy shows up in you, you become really triggered, judgmental, defensive. You might project on others because it's like that aspect is coming to the surface and you're like, whoa, 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 I'm not supposed to be you. Go down, go down, go down. Is that kind of how it functions?
Absolutely. You described 2 things you picked up on really well that I didn't describe as well as you. So one is if there are comments about other people or attitudes that you hear as you're growing up, like, oh, she's very interested in money, that can cause you to put talking about money or wanting wealth and abundance into your shadow. And that's why unblocked money, because it's a masculine trait. And so in women, the masculine traits can often be more hidden and vice versa. That could be very connected to shadow as well. And then you're quite right, all the things that you were particularly criticized for or personally saw other children suffer for, you're likely to have put into your shadow, unless you had a very opposite experience yourself.
I also want to chime in on just a tiny tangent in teaching that you touched on, Dr. Tar, that I think is so important. Many people don't realize this when they're going through unblocked shadow, and they certainly don't realize it when they're doing manifestation work. And then I'll go into why this is so important for manifestation. But you mentioned a really good example of, say, your parents were saying, like, stop showing off, or seeing your sibling that you're jealous of or whatever. But what I'm wanting to dissect there is that you can also hide in your shadow good qualities about yourself, which is really interesting to see. And that can present like not being able to take a compliment, not being able to receive is a version of that. And so that's really something to always kind of look at when you are doing unblocked shadow and you are doing this work. But I will pivot into manifestation and why this is so important that I figured out really early on. What we don't own owns us. And I certainly did not coin that term. It's been around in the shadow world for a very long time. And so getting back to the primary belief of neural manifestation is that you are literally just trying to get back to your totally whole, worthy, authentic self, the way we were when we came onto the planet, as that brand new baby, that fresh, clean slate. However, we go through a series just because of the human experience and our own parents or community or, peers not having full integration modeled to them. We tend to experience pain, shame, and programming throughout our life. And when we're experiencing that every time, like Dr. Tara was pointing out, we tend to create what I call an onion around us, a protective ego shell. So it's basically, this is the layer I need in order to be loved. And this is another layer I need that isn't truthful to myself, but I've been shown or told or experienced that if I am my true self, I won't be loved. So I'm going to create this other layer until we create this persona. And this persona is usually what we're walking around in the world as. However, because the universe's goal for us is to be our truly whole, authentic, worthy self, like the true us, the way we came onto this planet, our soul's desire to experience this lifetime, we need to peel all of that back. And all of those onion layers are shadow. They're masks we wear. They're personas we've created to be loved, cool, accepted. I can continue going on that list. However, in this work of neural manifestation, which is so different than the old New Age kind of spiritual bypass approach, the more you say no, the more that you can be your authentic self and be in your worth, the more magnetic you become. So why that's connected is the more you peel away an onion layer, which can present as being very different now in your current peer group, like that you're showing up as a totally different person and people are like, what's going on there? That actually creates tremendous magnetism. Or when I used to take clients and people would come to me and they're like, how do I grow my following? How do I grow my business? And I'm like, where are you hiding? Wherever you're hiding, wherever you're afraid to be seen, wherever you're not being your true authentic self is always an opportunity to become your most magnetic self and to create more magnetism. And that's why inner child work and shadow work, which tremendously go hand in hand and have a lot of overlap in the process, are the two most foundational workshops we always recommend the moment you sign up. You do how to manifest to learn the process, and then you go right into inner child and shadow to start to knock away that onion layer in order to create true magnetism, true authenticity, and then you continue the process. So that's how it's totally relatable to manifestation, which we can continue to dig in deeper.
Well, can I just completely back that up by saying when I was doing my research to do the Instagram post for To Be Magnetic on shadow, I found a really interesting kind of almost like a sub area of shadow, which is that if you have low self-esteem, you put good things into your shadow because like Lacy just said, you can't accept a compliment. So actual really strong qualities that you want to hide because maybe you think people will be jealous of you or you don't, deserve to have that good thing in your personality. And funnily enough, the other day I was saying to someone who I introduced to Be Magnetic that I'd said no to a few pieces of work that I didn't want to do anymore. And then all these amazing opportunities came in. And she said, remember what Lacy says, no is the most magnetic word. And so I was like, I can't believe you're saying this to me now. So, and the thing is, you have to have sufficient self-worth to turn down opportunities when you know that they're not right for you. If you don't have that, you'll just say yes to everything. And that is quite related to shadow. And it's also related to not passing tests, which is related to not manifesting.
I think something really interesting to point out there too for the new listener or the person who has been doing this work for a while but is taking this work deeper. I love that you just pointed out you're not capable of saying no, or maybe you are capable of saying no to something or setting a boundary if you haven't done that work, that shadow work. However, as we point out in Unblock Boundary, if you don't have the subconscious projection to back it up, it means nothing. And what we mean by that is, let's say you're saying no to something, you're setting a boundary, you are presenting, you're trying to present more authentically, but you haven't actually done the subconscious reprogramming. So for the new listener, that's our very unique process of hypnosis called deep imaginings that you go through. And you access these old memories that are the root of a shadow aspect of yourself, and you begin to do the healing and integration of it in hypnosis. If you haven't done that yet and you go to say no to something, or you're trying to present more authentically or bypassing that in any way, nothing will change. So I think that that's a really interesting, I just wanted to kind of build on that point that you were making of how important it is to actually do the subconscious shadow work.
Yeah, and I think that's actually a really good segue too into listing some of the signs that you'll notice that you have shadow work to do. So we just have a long running list here, but these are some of the things that once you notice this coming up, it's a sign that there are shadow words down there that need to be integrated. So if you're judgmental or judging others, you have trouble accepting compliments, you feel triggered by others' opinions of you, you're aggressively confrontational instead of, calm conflict resolution. You're scared to dive deep emotionally. You feel shame or embarrassment of your past or your present. You feel envy or jealousy. You feel stuck in repetitive cycles and don't make changes. You place blame on other people and situations. You're triggered by being told what you don't want or what you don't like. And you don't feel capable or calm and productive to have conflict resolution at all.
I also think another really important one that we're seeing a lot in society today is when we're super triggered by something in the media or another person, we lash out and like cancel culture is it's actually a really, really good example of shadow because it's actually hitting an inner wound that we have from childhood that's so painful for us that we haven't addressed. And the more we integrate it, we can actually show up rather than calling out or pointing fingers when we're really just like pointing 3 fingers back at ourselves of the work we need to do. We can actually show up inspirationally and lead through inspiration where actual change comes from. I had this happen recently, actually, with somebody we've had on the podcast. She's an unblocker as well, and somebody who's really struggled through a lot of things that have gone on last year. They've directly really affected her and been very painful. And she used to feel the need to do what most of us do. It's like lash out and cancel culture and all that kind of stuff. And then it hit her that she was like, whoa, I need to do some serious inner child and shadow on this. And the more she did, she realized, wow, now I actually have power to lead through inspiration, through being a muse, which is what, her career essentially is, through being a powerful voice that's integrated that people can listen to. So that's something to be very cognizant of this time too. And I'm not saying there's, no place for, certainly not saying, for people who are abusers and all of that kind of stuff. But I'm just saying often, usually when we're triggered by something like that, it's really important to also do the integrated shadow work.
And I think too, what you're saying, Lacy, is like there's a big difference between, let's say you hear a really horrific thing in the news. You're allowed to feel upset, angry, enraged, etc. There's nothing wrong with that. It's how you decide to channel your energy from that point. And so if you notice that you're going and tearing down others or tearing down yourself or in a bad mood the rest of the day and can't think straight, all of these things are signs that there's something deeper at play that may have been affected by you seeing this thing happen. But if you can sort of look at this horrific thing and say, okay, what are the ways I can use my innate abilities to change this cause if it really affects me? And what are ways that I can help problem solve that? It's almost like you can be bothered by both, but your reaction is what tells you where to go from there.
Yeah, and I think it's also like any other way we're triggered in our lives, it's always a call to action to look at why we're so triggered, because there's something personally going on there as well.
I also think it's interesting, and I'd love to hear what you two think about this, because we haven't particularly discussed this before, that aspects of ourselves are on a sort of spectrum. So when life's going well and we feel secure, the same aspect can manifest in a different way to when we are feeling acutely or chronically stressed. And in the last year, people have been under unprecedented stress. So it would make absolute sense to me as a former psychiatrist that the bad end of the shadow aspect is showing up more. So, for example, if you have this one aspect of your personality, which is that you are assertive and you are confident and you are very clear about what you've accomplished. But under stress, that becomes like bragging and putting other people down. Then it's important as well to know, how does this quality that is often a good quality of mine, how does it show up when I'm under stress? And doesn't always get worse, but the tendency is that when you're stressed, it's going to come out in more of a bad way. So I think some of those reactions, like getting more angry about something than maybe you normally would, can be because it's triggering you in your chronically stressed version of that aspect of your personality. Because Jung actually said that the shadow is the source of both our creative and destructive energies, and that this is related to the fact that once upon a time, they would have both had some sort of survival value. So in terms of actual physical survival, sometimes you have to destroy some things.
I really, really like that. And I think highlighting the stress factor is so, so huge, because I think everybody on different parts of the spectrum can relate to that right now. I mean, I can personally in my own life. I know we can on a global scale at this moment. And I think that that is a really great thing to perk people who are doing this work, your ears, your listening, to look at maybe, oh, that's another layer I can take through shadow.
Looking to kind of like a round table thing, just to get some more examples of like, well, what does a shadow word really look like, and how does it present when it's integrated versus not integrated? What are some examples or things that you guys have worked through shadow words in the past, and how were you able to reframe it? So, for example, one of mine in the past was the idea of trust issues, or being someone that had trust issues. It was very much in my shadow. You know, in society, they like, oh, it's a crazy girl. She has trust issues, daddy issues, you know, all of those really shameful terms. And so I didn't want to be someone that had that. So I rejected that that was even a problem in my life. And it wasn't until I was at a place where I could look at it and be like, oh no, that's exactly what's going on here. And the second I did that, I was able to now use this term trust issues as a resource and be like, cool, how can I fix this? Now that I have this thing that is bothering me, how can I own it and fix it and work on it and integrate it? And so now it's sort of like a remedy for me, because now I have a guidepost of where to go and where my work is. And so now, I mean, I'm saying it on a podcast that, 5-6 years ago, that would have been insane. I would have been like crying and cringing and would have never even admitted to that. My ego, pride, whatever you want to call it, was very bolsterous at that time. And so now saying it, I feel nothing. Like my heart's not racing. I'm not scared. I'm like, yeah, of course. That's definitely something I work through. And so it loses its charge in me.
Something I want to point out, just as a teaching for anybody listening, that's really cool about that is, and this is such a clear example of how shadow plays into manifestation. But so if we go back to 5 years ago, when that was such a scary shadow triggering word and you were doing everything possible to hide that consciously or unconsciously, what type of partners were showing up in your life at that time?
Yeah, the relationships were just a mess. And even dating partners, like, it took a rock bottom of a relationship to then understand, oh, this relationship ended because of trust issues. Like, there was other components too, but this was a big part of why that relationship was not successful. And so I would say within a year of admitting that and working through that, I was able to find my now partner, Daniel.
It's such a beautiful example. So for the person who's like, oh, this all sounds really scary to look at this, we have like a very specific 3-step process that we use in the workshop.
Yeah, it's reprogramming it, owning it, outing it, and then reinforcing the new.
So that 4-step process that you just labeled off, when you actually go through that, which is, it becomes incredibly easy when you get the hang of it, because you start to realize it's not nearly as scary after a couple of them. The beautiful thing is, because then it holds no more weight in you or no more real trigger in you. Maybe little stuff will be attached to it, but you're not embarrassed of it anymore. You're not ashamed of it. You're not doing everything you can to hide it anymore. You'll start to then attract the people who are totally fine with that and accept you for that. Your authenticity will start attracting others' authenticity. So that's just such a clear example of manifestation. And then, of course, you manifested your now partner that you live with. And it's a really beautiful outline of that arc. And I can certainly take the floor on this. It's an example I share a lot, but it was probably the first really cognizant experience I had with integrating my shadow. And that was I used to have the biggest shame and fear around really poor grammatical spelling issues, because I grew up with, 2 parents who had a little bit of college experience, and I was going back and forth from a couple of schools, but the primary ones I went to, because we lied and used my aunt's address so I could go to this school with my cousins, was a really fancy school with, everybody was wealthy and the parents were all higher education. And so I was really surrounded by, if you're not all of this, incredibly smart, well off, all the things of privilege, you're not lovable. And in fact, you're kind of trash. That was kind of what was being reflected. And that's a good example of, witnessed shadow. So that was something I carried really deep into my adult life, always so embarrassed of it, fearful of it. I somehow would surround myself around people that were quite smart and they would point it out and laugh at it, so it's just like perpetuated. And then it wasn't until I actually started the brand, and I was a blogger originally, that I had to address it, because I was like, I don't have a copy editor at first. I just have to be myself. And that's when I also started doing the early, what would become Unblocked Shadow for myself. And that was one of the pivotal points that I remember. And the word that would come up for me, because again, we teach you in Unblocked Shadow that we're all working through this month, you have to find the most accurate word that has the most activation around it. Because if you're not feeling that true activation, it means dig deeper. So a word that could have come up for me maybe could have been uneducated. And that would have not had like for me personally, a ton of activation. So I had to keep digging and digging until I found this word. And you'll notice that things that, again, getting back into what we were talking about before, things you project onto other people tend to be the exact same thing you need to work on yourself. And one thing that I would refer to kind of in fun passing, and I'm a part of this, I come from a very small town, would be hillbilly. And when I hit that word, hillbilly, that had all of this crazy weight and activation. That was the perfect shadow word that correlated to me, having terrible grammatical spelling habits. And when I finally owned it through that 4-step process that all of you are doing right now through Unblocked Shadow, that was it. It took everything away. And guess what? My blog started to take off because I didn't care anymore. And in fact, on top of not caring, I was really open and honest about it. I'd be like, I'm a terrible speller. I'm terrible grammatically. I just would own it. And just like Jessica was explaining, the shame and everything, because it's gone, you start to then attract people who, and again, mine was showing up. It wasn't totally in partnership. I was in partnership. It was showing up in press. It was showing up in a lot of events to go to, people who would share my work. So it would go way further because I was being so authentic, they were drawn to that. So that's where, again, getting back to the root of magnetism is true worth and authenticity. So I'm quickly interrupting this episode to invite you, if you're ready to start your manifestation journey, or if anything you've heard in our manifestation episodes has piqued your interest, to begin. We have a la carte workshops in everything from the basics bundle, which is what we recommend to everyone who starts. It's the formula that actually teaches you how to manifest, Unblocked Inner Child, and Unblocked Shadow. We also have a la carte workshops on love and money. But the real gem is the Pathway membership, because it encompasses every single workshop we have. It's a year-long membership with full access to the few a la carte offerings we have and exclusive workshops not available anywhere else, such as the daily practice, which is what everybody in the Pathway uses, hopefully at least 3 times a week to daily, in order to truly create the new neural pathways that one needs in order to manifest, and houses the library of our deep imaginings, which is our unique hypnosis process that allows you to get into your subconscious and overwrite those old neural pathways, creating the new ones. You can use our special code EXPANDED, all caps, EXPANDED, to receive $20 off your first a la carte workshop purchase, or $20 off your first month of the Pathway. Again, that's all caps, EXPANDED, EXPANDED. Okay, now back to the episode.
I love both your stories. I don't actually think we've got enough time to go through all the shadow stories that I have on my list, but they would include the, trust issue thing. And like, so proud of Jessica for saying it the way that she has, and kind of similar story for me. And with your one, Lacy, I think because my father had a huge shadow aspect around being uneducated, that all of my parents' resources went into educating us. And so we didn't really have any spare money for anything else. So, I was ashamed to invite my friends to my home. As a younger child, sort of hid the fact that we didn't have any spare money. And then, when I had some money of my own, maybe in my 20s, that I was very attached to things that signal that you have wealth, kind of like external things. And then it was only really, finally when you do the work that settles into a very quiet comfort with having the level of wealth that you have, whatever that level is. And then one that I actually, would love to hear what Lacy has to say about is, and I think this relates interestingly to what we were saying last time about sibling rivalry, is that I was in such denial about jealousy or envy that I always said I could never, ever be jealous of any of my friends. Like, I just don't have that cell in my body. And occasionally if people said to me like, oh, well, you must inspire jealousy in some people, I'd just be like, I just can't understand that I don't think that's true. I don't think anybody that I know would ever be jealous of me. And it was actually only when I did your work, so quite recently, that I was able to integrate that jealousy is part of people's personalities, and that anybody might feel that towards me, or I might feel it towards someone, and that's okay. I almost think like that complete denial that I had is, I wasn't even triggered because I just denied that it existed. So I think that's almost like a deeper form of shadow than some of my other examples.
Well, I love what you're saying about that. And I think we touched on this a little bit in the episode you're talking about, the envy and jealousy episode. I was actually with two friends yesterday, and we were like together chatting for 4 hours, like the way that people can do when you don't see enough people during this time.
Yeah.
And, something that I love that we brought up several times was, and I think I even said this in that episode, like if I find that people don't have my best interest, that I've let in close because I'm so warm and welcome and generous and open and like loyal beyond all loyalty, I will just be so loyal to people till the end. But the moment that I feel they aren't happy for me, or they don't want the best for me, or there's even a fraction of drama or jealousy of any kind or envy of any kind, I'm like, nope, you're out, you're gone, I'm done. I don't really have that towards people. And it's a lot of what you're saying. And the thing that I kept pointing out yesterday when we were having this conversation about this exact subject was, that's because I have a lot of shadow work to do. Why can't I accept and hold space for the person who has that going on? And then there's also the opposite side of the spectrum that I'm at a place too where life's too short and boundaries are too strong. And this is exactly what I said to my friends. I'm like, if I'm a doormat in that situation, which could be fine and could perpetuate and whatever, but I know that that's actually then blocking my wealth. It's blocking my love. It's blocking X, Y, and Z. And I don't have that time to waste, but I do recognize that I have work there to do. If I'm that triggered or that upset enough to have that much energy behind it, there's work for me. So I don't want to mitigate that boundaries aren't important and making sure that you're keeping things out of space that might be blocking it aren't important, but it's also recognizing, again, back to like you were giving the example, Jessica, of you're seeing something on the news that's so triggering, rightfully so. But if it's something that really has so much activation around it for someone, which usually tends to stem from fear or pain or shame, there's work there to be done. So I just really love that you said, Dr. Tara, that the first time you realized, because it was so sort of buried, you're like, oh no, this is shadow. I have that same thing in that process as well, even though I still honor boundaries and all of that.
I really like that example because I think that allows people to keep their boundaries that have them safe and help them with their manifestations. But then at the same time, it's not spiritual bypassing. It's really getting in and saying like, okay, I'm going to work on this and this activation, and I can be safe in this situation and not have someone around that potentially feels unsafe. and go at your own pace. You don't have to just keep all these activating people around for brute force just so you manifest quicker. Sometimes boundaries are necessary in those cases.
I love that. I think that's a really clear and important way to dissect it.
So one thing I wanted to bring up, because I thought it was really interesting, I heard on Armchair Expert with Dax Shepard, he was talking about how he had lack mentality, which is often, a shadow piece of not having enough money. And so he always felt like he needed to reach XYZ number to feel safe. And he reached that number and then he didn't feel safe. And he was like, oh no, I need to reach this number to feel safe. That's the number. And then he reached that number and he still didn't feel safe. And so he was saying, yes, the lack programming is keeping him from feeling safe. And if he can sort of integrate that shadow aspect, he could feel more integrated. But Salma Hayek was on the episode and she pointed out the lack programming actually wasn't what helped him manifest the money, because he did, in fact, manifest these numbers. And so what probably helped him manifest the money was a different programming, such as like, I'm a survivor, I can get what I want. And so I kind of wanted to pull this out a bit because I think so many times people think, well, my shadow aspect is helping me get there. It's helping me be gritty and fight through this difficult situation. And you see people who might have lack and then they go on to achieve big things in life. But what's really happening is it's an imbalance of another programming that might be happening that's allowing them to achieve and manifest the thing. It's a little bit layered of a concept, but I just wanted to point out for anyone who might be thinking, well, this shadow aspect or this aspect that I haven't integrated is giving me my edge to help manifest, when really, if they boiled it down and all the layers there, it is still blocking them in a lot of ways. And if Dax had integrated this, perhaps he would have achieved inner peace and not needed these numbers. Like, what do you have to say on that, Lacy?
I think actually that is such a beautiful, tangible example of realizing that money is energy. Again, I know we're talking about shadow, but I just want to highlight that. And that's something you will often hear always. Max even says this all the time. He's grown up around people with great wealth and all of that stuff. And he's like, there will never be enough. You're the only person who has control of enough. And so your authentic code, which is in How to Manifest, I think it's such a great outline when doing unblocked money or working on shadow, because when you really get into your authentic code, you have anchors. So for instance, one of my pillars of my authentic code is luxury. But for me, luxury really means quality for the most part. So it's like, I would rather have quality over quantity, and design, like great quality. So when you start to understand your true authentic soul desires rather than everything you're programmed to in the world. And this goes for everything, not just money or possessions or materialism. It goes towards the type of partner you think you want based on what society has told you, the type of career you think you're supposed to have based on what society has told you. When you can really root down and start to understand your authenticity, that's a beautiful anchor point. Then from that point, when you're working through unblocked money, which you find your very own money code, or you're working through unblocked shadow, you start to look at the ways that lack can show up in every way in your life. It can show up like in our jealousy and envy episode. That's lack in either capacity. So what I love about the example you gave is we have so many tools that help you go from this really abstract place of who you think you're supposed to be or have or do in order to be loved, and rooting you back into your true authenticity. And the way to do that, again, is through shadow work. And then ultimately, that's going to anchor you into money as energy. So, like when you're doing unblocked money, you start to understand the energetics of money. And therefore, you start to really integrate and release that lack. So ultimately what that does is it opens enough space for anything you truly desire, your soul truly desires, to come through.
And I'd just like to add, from the sort of psychiatry and psychology point of view, that I think there are some ways that people use words that cause confusion here. So it's very similar to me to how people sometimes say, oh, there is such a thing as good stress. But the definition of stress is when the load on your body, physically, mentally, emotionally, spiritually, is too much for you to bear. And similarly with shadow, the shadow isn't the thing that gives you the edge that makes you successful. It's only integrating shadow that can make you successful. That the whole point of putting things into your shadow is that it's holding you back because it's unseen. So it's not the lack mentality that led to the money. It's exactly as Jessica said, if that had been integrated, the chances are that it would have led to a much better outcome. And better doesn't always mean more money. It might be like Max says, it might be that I feel I have enough. That might be the best outcome. And especially where Dax has equated it to safety. Better might be, I feel safe. I don't need to do X to feel safe.
And that you become more magnetic and things come your way.
Exactly.
And I think, too, people underestimate. They're like, yeah, safe is cool, but like, I want the money. And it's like, can you imagine a world in which you don't want that material item, where the internal world is so taken care of, you feel so whole that you actually aren't craving that money like that? It's so interesting how this work starts to reveal so much more of your integrated soul as you're unraveling.
And I think that's the true message of consciousness at the end of the day. Doesn't mean you'll be broke. Certainly can actually mean that you will be incredibly financially successful. But I think that's the message we, receive from all of the teachers of that time, may it be Eckhart, Marianne Williamson, that had this awakening. It's essentially Buddhism at the end of the day. It's unattachment. It's not spiritual bypass version of unattachment, but it's getting to the root of unattaching from things that society has told you, or materialism or whatever, that you need to be loved, and actually getting present and in the moment. And therefore, all of those people that I just named off are very financially successful. So it's a good example of, reaching true or being on the pursuit of true consciousness.
And this is a slight tangent, but it's making sense in my head because of something we discussed earlier, which is, and I want to speak a little bit about some of the sort of ethnic minority people that we interact with, which is that I come from a culture where I was told as a little girl that a woman who spends the night outside of her father's house or her husband's house is a bad woman. What that did to my shadow about my sexuality, and I'm talking about even wearing a short skirt, let alone having sex, is a similar thing about society telling you this or that about money or love in its broadest sense of the word, and what that can do to your sense of self and your sense of safety. So I think it does come down to exactly what you both said, which is it's consciousness and Buddhism, which is the lack of attachment to the kind of meaning that society puts on all sorts of things, money, love, whatever.
And I also think it highlights a really important, for everybody doing this work, which, people are coming from all different walks of life, really looking at cultural shadow that you've been programmed that maybe don't align with your true authentic self. And I would see that a lot with clients early on. I had clients of every type of culture, and we really would have to address that based on what their soul's authentic code was, or their dreams were, and their hopes were. Anything that was conflicting with that may not truly align, on a subconscious level with their actual soul.
Yeah, even like educational or professional success. There must be so many stories like this, but I actually became tearful when I heard the story, got triggered, obviously, when I heard the story, which was about a really successful woman of Chinese, Asian descent, but American, saying that when she was born, her father was so disappointed that she was a girl that she basically spent the rest of her life trying to prove herself by getting higher education and having a really successful career. But there was nothing she could do that was going to, aside from changing her gender, that would satisfy what was in her father's shadow. So, she would have to work on, again, the unattachment to what society says about your value as a person based on things that aren't actually who you are.
I think you highlight a really great point in there too, Dr. Tara, which is that when we're being shamed by others or watching others shame other people in the community or whatever, or judge them or ridicule or pass, their ethical standard on them, that is their shadow. And so if we can start witnessing that as that instead of the rules of the world, or the rules of society or how we need to placate, even though they might be an incredible person. If you see that person casting their shadow out, it kind of gives you a little bit more understanding of, oh, okay, I don't have to now cower in fear or put this thing in my shadow, because I can just witness their shadow and understand it as that instead of internalizing it and perpetuating the cycle.
I have to say that's been probably one of the most freeing aspects of this work, especially like myself, like at this point, it's a little bit more public and whatnot. Anytime we're getting a bad review or somebody's, casting their shadow on X, Y, and Z, I can always be like, I just send them love. I see it so clearly what's being triggered, not only psychically, but also just recognizing their shadow, and they're on their process, they're on their journey. And it's a really, not saying I'm always that Zen, but that's a really freeing thing when you begin to integrate your own shadow. You are able to be very compassionate with other people's shadow while not taking it on at the same time.
Yeah. And I think there's a big difference between feedback and shadow. There's just an energetic difference of, oh, this person genuinely cares, this is what they're feeling, and oh, okay, this triggered something deep within this other person that they're really talking about their relationship with their father through this review or whatever it may be.
Yeah. And I think a really great way to decipher which is one's usually respectful, the other's triggered. And myself, when I see myself with Max giving very triggered feedback, I'm like, seems to have a lot more to do with myself than it does with Max. So, that's a really good way to decipher between the two of, am I really interacting with somebody else's shadow, or am I interacting with some, wonderful feedback that I could integrate and learn from?
Daniel's really good at this, but he'll call out in the middle of a conversation. He'll be like, okay, I will clean the dishes, but is this really about the dishes? And I'm like, oh, damn really it, he got me.
Yeah, but this is also the guy that gives you a cuddle before you have an argument. So.
I know. Unicorn.
One more thing I do want to circle back to, just because it always confuses me, is the positive aspect in shadow. So where we see someone judge, like that to me makes sense. It's like, okay, they were judged. I don't want that. I don't want to be that. I'm going to stick it in my shadow. For example, a positive aspect of myself that I reject is, a kid, I think I said this on the podcast before, but like my elementary crush called me fat. And so that really wasn't the shadow word that I wound up hiding and putting down. It was more fit. What I took from that was I can't be seen as fit because then I'm not fit enough. I'm going to think I'm fit enough, but then someone else will call me fat, and thus I need to get more fit. So essentially the positive aspect was fit, and it was like I can never be fit enough, so I have to stick this back here. How does that work? Is it our brains trying to protect us from not being that thing enough, and thus it rejects us ever being that? How does that sort of dynamic work? I also just want to point out that people can be fat and fit, but society and a lot of programming believes us to find otherwise. So I just want to make that disclaimer in there as well. This is just what my brain picked up as a child and how I interpreted things. But obviously, you can be both of those things, and they can be incredible.
I'll let you take that first, Dr. Tara, from a psychological perspective.
So I think, being called fat obviously has a strong impact on the body image of a young child or even an adolescent. But if you tried to get really fit and you didn't quite make it enough, there's a risk that you're still going to get called not fit enough, slightly out of shape, or fat. So I think it is the fear that you don't want to be that thing. But if you show that you're trying too hard to be really different to that and you fail, then you'll end up being that word that you were called.
I also think, like, what comes to my mind if I were sitting here working with somebody, I would instantly be like, How much were you exposed to beauty catalogs? Was fitness really important to your mom or your community around you? And based on your gender or, the way that you present in the world, how much does fitness mean to be loved? Because I could really see the different neural pathways in your brain kind of coming back to, well, that's the pinnacle of acceptance and love and popularity. And then fat is the opposite. It could be just based on how your brain is maybe communicating or working with it. It's the opposite side of the spectrum. So is there any validity in that, Dr. Tara?
Yeah. It's kind of like the other side of the coin. So they end up going hand in hand, even though they weren't necessarily, but that's the sense you make of it. Especially, like you said, if you had a role model that was really into fitness, then you merge those two things. Like, I should be like that, but someone said I'm like this. And then it becomes what you make of it with your combination of what's imprinted on your neural architecture.
And then, like if I were working with the client, I would certainly look at specifically, and I can relate to this growing up. I remember at such a young age, probably five or six, being like, I'm fat. I remember saying that to my uncle, my Iranian uncle, who was like, what? Like, where is she picking this up from? But I, had an 18-year-old mom and was exposed to the beauty and the fashion and all of the things. When you hear something like what, Jessica heard from this person whose opinion really mattered to her at the time, how much deeper of an imprintation does that have on your subconscious versus if she had heard it from a passerby or on the street?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's both how long it's been in your neural architecture, so the younger you are, and obviously more if it's repeated, but it's absolutely the emotional intensity of it. So if that was your first crush, there's a huge amount of emotional intensity associated with that.
So when taking that through the unblocked work and hitting on that memory, as you often say, which is such a great way to decipher the difference, because we'll say, get a healing now, reprogram it now when you're in that hypnotic state. And a lot of people would be like, wait, am I changing my memories? This is bad. Like, am I lying? This isn't reality. And you say so well, no, you're changing the emotion associated with the memory. How long would you say, and I know that we can't really take time, we can't really say time when it comes to creating a new neural pathway, but how much repetition, how deeply would somebody have to continue to address the emotion attached to that experience to really help to unlock and loop differently, projecting confidence based on that shadow?
Yeah, that is a really difficult one to answer, because I know from personal experience that you can do that DI once and it can create a huge amount of healing. But I would have to say from my scientist brain that the sort of formula of how long it's been there and the amount of emotional intensity that was associated with getting you to the point that you're at today, you will need that equal amount to get you out. But that doesn't mean if you were 5 and you're now 25 that it's 20 years worth of work. It means that doing the deep work with the DIs, doing daily reprogramming, because there's a lot of emotional intensity associated with the work. And so it's not the same amount of time, but the formula is length of time times emotional intensity. And so the time can be shortened, but you must have that repetition and really get into the DI and feel it very deeply emotionally to get a quicker response time. But like I said, it can be anything from the first time, because, often we have a visceral response, including crying to something that's said in the DI. And that's good because that's obviously a deep emotional response. And particularly that crying means that your central nervous system is fluid and open to change. But obviously for some people, it could require some repetition. But as long as you do the regular work and you do allow it to settle deeply in your central nervous system, then you can shorten it. I really can't say an exact amount of time, but it's sort of a formula, but it depends on people's recollection and emotional intensity.
And I have a last question on that, because I notice this within myself, and I certainly would see this with clients. When you say you hit that memory and you're changing the emotional intensity attached to it, you're reprogramming that, and you have such a deep healing around it, and it's so cathartic, and you're so aware of it now, and you're following that 4-step formula inside of Shadow, and you out it. You know, that's like a big part of the process, is having to out the shadow. May it be to somebody whose opinion you care about the most, maybe social media, like whatever holds the highest stakes for you, which could essentially be like, what you talk about, Dr. Tara, accountability. When you finally out it and you continue to out it and you continue to say, you don't bypass it because you've done some of the subconscious work and continuing to approach the subconscious work through other DIs and stuff, daily practice, maybe not totally associated to this, but you out it and you continue to own it. How does that look for creating a new neural pathway? Does that help because it's continuing to reinforce?
Oh, completely. Because one of the steps of the process is raised awareness. So it's raising it from non-conscious to conscious, which is basically raising it from shadow to persona or shadow to ego. The outing part of it, I actually believe, is 50% of the process, because the grip of shadow is that you don't know about it. As soon as you know, that's 50% done. And then, you have to do the DIs and the journaling, and you have to do it regularly. And you have to allow yourself to go, to some places that might make you feel like crying or whatever, trigger. But the outing part is 50%, because it doesn't matter how many times you repeat any process. If you are in denial and you don't even admit it in a DI, then it's not going to change.
And just to give, context for what sort of the healing or reinforcing looks like, in that example I was giving before, it was both reprogramming, I think I've said this before too, but reprogramming this kid calling me fat to seeing fat as a positive thing, integrating fat with also you can be fit too, like seeing how those things are intertwined and redefining the word and what that meant. But the bigger thing was because I didn't feel connected to fit, to me, it really boiled down to I have to reject this part of me in order to keep myself hypervigilant almost, to make sure I'm the most fit, to make sure I'm not blindsided by my childhood crush coming back and saying something that is painful. And so integrating fit is, I love this. I'll share it on here. There's a thing going around on TikTok and it's like, stomachs can look like this and also look like this. Backs can look like this and also like this. And so that is it's basically showing like your stomach looking, posing in a way that looks thinner or smaller, and then one with like lots of rolls, and it's saying both are the same person, both the same stomach. And that's what I had to integrate is fit means I can look like this and like this. I can look fat and be fit. I can look thinner and be fit. I can look, have rolls or cellulite and be fit. So it's integrating all of these things and reinforcing that and seeing different body types and seeing they're all desirable, they're all lovable, they're all deserving of everything you can imagine. So that reinforcing and then looking at different body types, that's when that shift starts to take place.
See, I think it's so interesting how one comment at a certain age is so standout for people. And, I have some negative ones as well, like you, but I had a neighbor who, when I was, I guess, in my early teens, bit awkward, super skinny, like looked so young, I couldn't get into like 13 movies or 18 movies with my friends and things. She said to me, when you're 30 plus, all your friends will be jealous of how you look. And I remembered that. So, and for so long into my 30s, I would get ID'd, I would get, questioned about my qualifications because I looked too young and blah, blah, blah. And recently, because, we've been almost a year in lockdown and I haven't dyed my hair for a year. And I've actually realized it's not as bad as I thought it was when I was dyeing it. Someone said to me, I'm saying this to you because I love you, but you should dye your hair. And I actually think, because it's so in that person's shadow, that they meant it positively. And she said, because, don't you want to look youthful? And I was like, I've looked youthful my whole life. I want to look grown up, finally. So I think it's, it's obviously youthfulness is in her shadow. Because I had that one really good experience early in life from that neighbor, that's really stuck in my neural pathway. But what I was at the point I was actually trying to make, because it could have had a bad effect, could have triggered me, is that shadow comments from other people will sometimes come in the guise of, I really care about you, so I'm telling you this. And that's why it's so important to do the work, because otherwise you could easily get sucked into that.
Yeah. And I think that's, kind of going back to the feedback versus somebody else's shadow thing too, really, really starting to decipher that. And I think it's incredibly important in this time when everything's so heightened in every possible way, shape, and form for everybody's mental and personal sanity.
Yeah, I love that one, Tara, because there are so many, I don't know what it is. I feel like it's a East Coast thing or a Jersey thing, but that line of, I'm only telling because I love you, but you need to put makeup on, or you need to do this, or you need to do that. And I'm like, going home now and I hear that and I'm like, oh boy, this is not good. What's going on here? So it's really interesting to reflect back after integrating all of those things.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, thank you both so much. There's so much to unpack here, and I can't wait to dive into shadow. Thank you both so much, and we'll see you guys next week.
Thank you so much, Jessica and Dr. Tara. It's been a great conversation.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you so much for tuning into the episode, and I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did, we did. And in case you're not totally ready to join the pathway yet, I wanted to share a few of our free offerings that I'll often suggest to people as a little bit of a blueprint to get them started on their manifestation journey. The first place I like to direct people completely for free is the motivation. You can see it linked below or on our homepage as our testimony library. And it's categorized by different subjects, whether you're calling in career, money, love, wellness, and much more. When you're reading about a member's experience of what they manifested, you're actually seeing to believe and showing your subconscious that that very thing is possible for you. The second place I like to direct people is to the free clarity exercise, which is also linked below. In it, you get to try our own unique hypnosis process, learn about the science, and some journaling prompts. And the best part about this, you'll get a tiny taste of what it's like to go into your hypnotic state, bring your subconscious forward, and create new neural pathways while receiving clarity. And the third thing, if you haven't listened to it on this podcast yet, please go back to the episode titled Manifestation 101, where you'll learn the basics of neural manifestation to truly understand this process. So go ahead and check out those free resources, the motivation, the free clarity exercise, and the episode Manifestation 101, all linked below. And in an effort to make sure to have representation in this process series, go ahead and submit any process testimonials you have, especially to our LGBTQ+ community, our BIPOC, as well as the Ys, which is anyone in the community who is 45 and over. All right, we'll be back next week.